Panel, we do not want to instrumentalize Finland to condemn Russia. We don't think that condemning Russia has a particularly good track record of changing Russian behavior. We stand for peace in the region, and we stand for Finnish autonomy and neutrality. I will tell you why Russia has no interest in attacking Finland. I will tell you why Russia becomes more dangerous after we join NATO, and I will tell you that even if we join NATO and Russia attacks, that's terrible. We would rather have a Russian Finland than World War III, and I'm also going to talk about some other harms of NATO. First of all, Russia has no interest in attacking Finland. Putin, as like an undemocratic leader, still needs to clearly justify each instance of an invasion, right? He doesn't do this on measures of regional strategy. He does this on a very specific justification of a greater Russia, right? This is ethnic. Each actual instance of Russian intervention in Crimea, in South Ossetia, uses this very specific justification. It's done to protect ethnic Russia. We have a clear responsibility to them. There is no region in Finland where these are majority. Furthermore, where ethnic Russians exist in Finland, they don't like Russia. Why? Because Finland, unlike Ukraine, has a very high standard of living, and they would rather they be Finnish than Russian, right? What does this mean? So like actually attacking would not be publicly justified. We don't think Russians are these crazy trolls that go, oh, Putin wants to attack Finland, so I guess that's okay. No, they go like, that's actually not okay, we don't want to do this. When this is also economically costly, it becomes completely unjustified to do this. Opening government tells us that Russia has never attacked a member of NATO. Well, they have neither attacked any country where it doesn't make sense to attack them in the first place, right? They only do so when there is sort of a clear justification based on ethnicity, right? And when there is a welcoming population that facilitates that invasion. Why does Russia become more dangerous when we join NATO? Because military maneuvering, right? Like for instance, the instances of infringement on Finnish airspace are not signals for Finland, but they are domestic. Like this is domestic politics. It's the idea that Russia has to defend itself somehow that props up an undemocratic regime, right? It is still sort of like propping up this narrative that conventional warfare is still relevant, that Russia is isolated, that there are hostility that is just used to like justify sort of dissent and justify extensive sort of executive powers of sort of Putin's government, right? But now, right, that domestic political game, when we join NATO, becomes legitimized because it's actually true, right? Like there actually is hostility. Suddenly, we have kilometers and kilometers of borders with like a member of NATO. That's kind of scary, right? There is a violation in what we consider to be partially our sort of sphere of influence, right? So suddenly, what we did when we were sending planes over Finland made a lot of sense. Like when Putin like did that, like he was actually acting in a way that like, you know, he really should have, right? So this is really bad because it means it's more likely that Russia actually does escalate militarily because because the government is able to use money how they want because there aren't sort of like super strong democratic checks on how they use their money, right? Even if there are sort of economic sanctions that put constraints on what they can do. But it's also like, I mean, like we think it's also a domestic issue. Like it's used to prop up like an undemocratic regime. We don't think this is fair for like Russians who actually do want to have like a better say in terms of how they are governed and these types of things. Like opening government tells us that like, oh, these sort of like, you know, other Baltic states need them. Well, like, okay, like they are members of NATO, but even if they weren't, like Russian military escalation and a justification of these types of things isn't particularly good for regional safety. I'll take closing.
Sure. So you say that this will anger Russia. Aren't these sanctions, which presumably you are committed to and are outside of Finland's control, also likely to cause that anger?
Right, but like when for the first time in history there are like hundreds of kilometers of bordering with like NATO, right? Like when Russia sees this big thing that they see as an enemy suddenly is right there, suddenly so close. When Finland like jumps over to the other side after like, you know, decades and decades of neutrality, that becomes a much bigger threat. That becomes a really, really important thing. We think this is really bad. No. So the thing is, we think that, let's say, okay, Finland joins NATO because apparently Russia does present an actual threat, right? And let's say that Russia actually does attack. First of all, there's actually no guarantee that Article 5 will be invoked. There's actually no precedent for this. We think that in most countries, they are going to have to publicly justify why we're going to like spend a lot of money and put our sort of people at risk for like Finland, right? There isn't actually precedent for this, and we don't think it's necessarily the case that like NATO provides this type of protection. We think that Russia knows this. They know that there isn't this guarantee, which means that if we want to attack them, guess what? It might not actually be the case that they would get protection. But if the US does like invade, so like we're kind of screwed because now you have like two nuclear powers fighting against each other, right? In 2013, the Russian foreign minister literally said that if Sweden or Finland join NATO, that begins World War III. So like when opening government, like that's like a literal quote. So when opening government says that people want to feel secure, this isn't particularly conducive to feelings of safety and security for people's lives. It's really, really, really scary, and people know it's scary and they don't want to happen. So if like, but like, on our side of the house, right, if Russia attacks anyway, because we're stupid, we didn't join NATO, oh no. First of all, we think that Finland can defend itself. My partner is actually a member of the Finnish Reserve, I'm very proud to say. I think he has shown clear capabilities that he could fend off the Russian bear. But, like great, I think that does deserve it. No, thank you. But, if it does invade, it's better, like, okay, so what might happen is that, okay, Finland falls under Russia. Like, it's extremely unlikely scenario, but that's better than, like, the annihilation of the world. That's better than the prospect that the United States and Russia, for the first time, are going to come into, like, nuclear confrontation, right? So the thing is, like, we say that even in the worst-case scenario, we don't really see the harms as being significant enough to justify the prospect of, like, World War III. Furthermore, we tell you that there are all these other harms of joining NATO in the first place. There's less neutrality, there's less autonomy. You have to get involved in conflicts that you might not actually support, you might not agree with, that might be domestically unpopular. It's expensive, right? It might also mean that Russia goes, oh, you joined NATO, guess what, bye-bye, like you're not gonna get any of like our gas, right? Like, so there's a lack of access to Russian resources which hurts Finnish people. So, like, essentially what we tell you, this is like just a really terrible idea because Russia doesn't actually want to attack Finland, and that's really clear. Russia becomes more dangerous when we join NATO. Even if we join and Russia attacks, that would be terrible. So we're really happy to oppose.